Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Nick Davies and I'm a Programme Director here at the Institute for Government. On behalf of the Institute and the Productivity Institute, thank you very much for joining us for this 5th event in our Productivity Pitches series, with today's focus being on schools. Productivity in public services has never been more important. Labour used its first budget to meaningfully increase spending in this year and next, but spending from April 2026 onwards is going to be much tighter. So many of the improvements that the government is hoping to see in public services are likely to have to come from productivity improvements. The aim of this event is to highlight examples from the front line of outstanding improvements that have been made and to reflect on the lessons that can be learned more broadly. And today we've got 3 great case studies. So first up will be George Barlow, Principal of Belgrave and St Bartholomew's Academy, who will discuss the outcomes of providing every pupil and teacher with a tablet. He'll be followed by Steph Hamilton and Cara Ackroyd, who explain how Outwood Grange Academy Trust have integrated the use of data into their strategy and processes to support outcomes. And our third presentation will be Lauren Wilson on how the Thinking Schools Academy Trust consolidated communications and marketing functions, allowing them to standardise their marketing materials. Each presentation will last 10 minutes and there'll be 10 minutes of questions to follow each one. And then to wrap up, I will be joined on stage by Professor Anna Vignoles, Director of the Leverhulme Trust and Policy Advisor at the Productivity Institute Policy Unit to discuss common themes across the 3 presentations. If you have any questions for our panellists and you're in the room, please raise your hand. And if you're watching online, you can submit them using the Q&A function and you can start submitting those questions now. I will also be live tweeting from @IFG Events, and I'd also like you to tweet or post on whatever platform you're using hashtag productivity pitches. Right, without further ado, I'm going to hand over remotely, hopefully, to George Barlow.
Hello, thank you. It's great to be here virtually. Apologies, I can't be there in person, but I definitely didn't want... A little bit of context about us as a school and us as a trust. So we're part of St Bart's Multi-Academy Trust, which is 23 academies, all primary school with 1 all through special school. Every child in our trust has access to a one-to-one device. My school at Belgrave, I'm the executive principal across Belgrave and a special school linked to our main site. We have really high levels of EAL, high levels of pupil premium, and as we're seeing nationally, an increase in SEND and the need to meet the needs of SEND children and be as inclusive as we possibly can as a primary school. Our journey with one-to-one devices, I think, for us, there's quite a culture in education at the minute of people starting with the outcome and trying to do things for Ofsted or to tick a box on a framework, whereas I think sometimes we need to get back to the core of why we implement change. And for us, our journey with technology, we saw a real opportunity to meet the need of all learners in settings and become more inclusive, give children real access to hands-on learning and the features in tablets that could support them in their journey through primary school, and remove lots of barriers. We did that through developing a consistent teaching and learning approach, which was agreed, shared, and became common language, which has resulted in a really high quality education. Impact on our pupils. I am really, really confident in thinking, and we looked at the World Economic Forum and the top 10 growing skills for employers in the future. I think we're at a point now where we're moving into a future that we don't know what it's going to look like, but we can be sure that children need skills that we've never thought they needed moving into employment. So things like creativity, analytical thinking, the use of tech and AI. And I'm really confident our pupils have got a really strong grasp of those skills and will carry those skills onto the next stage of academic progress and also into lifelong learning and employment. We've seen a really huge impact on independence and access to resources. So rather than the traditional model of children printing resources, having access to paper-based things, they get all of that now through their iPads at the click of a button. And we talk about knowledge at the fingertips of children. So we're now having a focus on teaching children to be critical users of technology, because ultimately, if we remove technology completely, when they get home, they've all got access to devices, they've all got access to YouTube, for example. How can we channel that into being used purposefully to have a positive impact on their lives? Impact on staff, and I've got some really high quality measures of the impact on staff in terms of well-being and streamlining processes. I'd say our staff at the main site at Belgrave are leaders in education and are positive disruptors and are willing to take risks. The creativity and innovation in planning, high quality teaching and learning across school has really had a positive impact on the quality of education and ultimately the outcomes for all children. So there's a quote there at the top of this slide, and it says, "Technology allowed TAs to support and teachers to teach," which came from a really experienced member of staff when we started our journey. And I thought I'd do a little bit more digging into this and look at some impact measures. When I spoke to this teacher, he said that the technology has removed and streamlined admin processes, which has allowed them to become more creative and focus on pedagogy, up-to-date research, and then applying that in the classroom. So, for example, on the left-hand side there, you can see pre-tech staff were saying that they were spending up to 2 hours an evening giving feedback on work, whether that's history, maths, English, whereas post-tech, it was taking a maximum of 30 minutes. And that feedback, most importantly, was improved and much higher quality. We know from the research that the best feedback is that live feedback in a lesson to address misconceptions. But through the technology, we've got a really personalised approach now of leaving voice notes, which children can access independently and improve and reflect on prior learning and make progress. So on average, staff were saving over 7.5 hours per week, which they can then reinvest. We're not saying that staff have now got 7.5 hours per week to do nothing. We know that isn't true in education. There's always something we can be doing. But what they can do now is focus on being a teacher and improving outcomes in teaching, learning, and pedagogy. Another quite frightening stat for me when we did this impact measure was 60% of my staff at the main site were saying they were having to work at the weekend to stay on top of workload. Post-tech, it was 10%. Again, as principal of the school, I was a little bit disappointed that wasn't zero, but doing a little bit more digging and speaking to those staff, it was choice, so they had the flexibility. So, for example, one member of staff stated that everyone was out of the house on a Sunday morning, the children were swimming, it was their time where they preferred to do the work. So in a world where post-pandemic we've moved into a lot of industries and companies offering a hybrid approach, we've managed to find some flexibility in a really timetable heavy environment in education. Support staff were spending 15 minutes per day printing, sticking, completing admin tasks, laminating resources, which actually, as an investment as a head teacher, isn't what I wanted their role to be. I wanted them to focus on intervention, teaching and learning, working with children rather than completing these admin tasks. So through the implementation of technology, they now don't have to complete those admin tasks and have saved, as you can see on the bottom right in the impact measure, a lot of time to reinvest back into children and complete those interventions. In terms of culture and practice, we've had to be very challenging around the curriculum and think about why we do a lot of things in education. I think we fell into that trap of we've always done it this way. It seems to work. Why should we change? But actually, a really impactful measure that we looked into was every lesson, pupils were expected to stick in a lesson objective, write today's date, that traditional layout of what an exercise book should look like. We worked out that if that was 5 minutes per day over 4 lessons, multiply that by teaching days, children were spending 65 hours, and that's just on a minimum, sticking in those lesson objectives and writing dates. And we thought, teachers are complaining all the time and talking about we haven't got time to really deepen knowledge and skills. What can we do then? How do we improve this? We need to take that away. So the culture has now become, is the task improving outcomes for children and staff, or is it proving something to external stakeholders? If it's proving, we don't do it anymore. If it's improving, we look to continue to advance that and make it even better. But as you can see there, there's some really quick wins through using technology that can give you that learning time and maximize that learning time in the classroom and have a really positive impact on pedagogy and learning. I always like to, we've got these impact measures that are really tangible in terms of time, but some of the measures, and we talk about these soft skills and things that we want to develop, but for me, there are some examples we talk about big ticket issues such as retention in teaching. We don't really get a turnover of staff at school now, and teachers say things like, I can't imagine teaching without technology anymore, or what did it look like before? I think that's because we're giving staff that time back to have a little bit of flexibility and also have a healthy work-life balance without dropping our standards. We've got a personal story here of I showed a CEO of another trust, quite a big trust locally, around school, and his daughter was an ECT, looking for a job, and she chose to apply at our school, and he totally understood why when he'd seen the tech in action and the benefits the technology was having on children and also staff. When I look at exclusion nationally, again, another big ticket item currently, we had a young man who was on the verge of exclusion pre-tech. We introduced the technology, and for the first time, when we tracked his journey through the technology, he was being successful in communicating and being successful in terms of that brain science of dopamine, being successful getting that motivation, which means he built his self-esteem, he got to year 6, and he's now flourishing in high school. And on reflection, that is because technology made learning accessible. It allowed him to be a successful member and feel like he belonged in our school. We gave him the tool to remove those barriers. Another quick success story and impact measure, we set up a speak out line through the technology. So a safe space, a safeguarding space for all our children. Just before Christmas, a young girl that was doing really well academically, no concerns in terms of safeguarding and support at home, left us a little message on there just to speak to a trusted adult to say that unfortunately her mum couldn't afford to put food on the table over Christmas and they wouldn't be having Christmas presents this Christmas. And I know that's only a small example of where we supported and got those presents and supported with food bank vouchers, but without the technology, I don't think she would have had the voice or confidence to have spoken up and for us to have acted on that information. So I always like to end with those personal impact measures and those micro examples, because I think they're just as powerful in terms of impact as the bigger impact measures that I've shared.
George, thank you very much. I'm just going to ask a question or two before opening up to questions from the audience. And I think the first one I have is, how much did all of this cost and where did the money come from? Budgets are obviously tight and it's been really impactful in terms of staff time. It's really interested in how you afforded it.
Yeah, so the initial outlay, so it's 420 devices to be in pupil hands, charging solutions, stylus solutions. I think we were looking at around, it was £70,000 on a 4-year cycle. But in the first year, for example, we saved £17,500 on printing. I then built in staff time. I also built in, and anyone that's worked in a primary school will know about resources, and glue sticks was always an issue. We'd have staff arguing over glue sticks. Building in all of that money, we are actually making money over a 4-year period now by investing initially in that technology. I think it enabled me to employ another member of support staff across school due to the amount of saving. And it does look like a large initial outlay, but actually a long-term investment.
Thank you. I'm going to open up to questions from the audience. If you could say your name and where you're from, and if you can show it's actually a question and not a statement, that would be great. I'll take questions. We've got one at the front here.
Thanks, George. Philip Nye from Institute for Government. You talked about the way that the tech is used in marking and in reducing some of the admin burden on staff. I wondered if you could say a little bit about what you've done in lessons, how you can use the tech there.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So, for example, there's a traditional model, isn't there, that we have to write everything to showcase our knowledge and understanding in a lesson. I'm thinking of an example from the top of my head. So year one, for example, we're doing science and classification of animals. And I went into the classroom and they had AR animals in the classroom and we're describing why that animal was classified as a mammal, a bird, a reptile. So it gives that creativity and innovation in the classroom that is transforming teaching and learning. And again, removing barriers for SEND learners. So if I was a SEND learner pre-tech that struggled to write, I've almost got a barrier across the curriculum, whereas we've removed those barriers through this innovative use of tech and leaving voice notes and creating iMovies or using AR.
Just on that question of writing, so there's a question that's come in online and they've asked, have you found that the use of iPads has had an impact on students' ability to write with pen and paper? And another question, have you seen any impact on students' attention spans?
Great question. Again, we still do write. So if children are producing a final published piece of writing, that is part of our writing process. But what it has allowed us to do, again, our outcomes in writing are still, considering we are 83% EAL, for example, Key Stage 2 outcomes were 82%. So well above national again. The technology has allowed children can showcase that writing in a number of different ways. So if they write in a book, they will take a picture and get the feedback through the technology. So they're still having those high quality opportunities to write. I think it's almost refined the quality of writing and made us really think about the quality of writing across the curriculum rather than having a detrimental impact. In terms of attention, no, we've not seen a detrimental impact. We've seen increased engagement and passion for learning because of the collaborative approach and the way children can showcase skills and knowledge. So, yeah, we've not really seen. And I know there's quite a lot in the media at the minute, isn't there, about screen time? But I think we've got to be really clear on what is the purpose of the screen time. This isn't a behaviour management tool. This is a purposeful teaching and learning tool. So.
And on that screen time, someone else has asked to use blue light filters to protect growing eyes.
Yes. So lower down again, we reduce the contrast. We use blue light filters. We've got the screen protector that reduce blue light as well, and that isn't a heavy investment in terms of cost. So,
great,
definitely worth doing if you're exploring.
Got another question from the audience.
Hello, Andrew Haldenby of the Effective Governance Forum, which campaigns for better management in government and public sector. George, thank you very much indeed. This may be a question for the broader discussion, but I can't resist asking. One of the things I wanted to raise today was the rise in absence since the pandemic, which certainly around where we live is a noticeable change, and it's having massive impacts on children and families more generally. And it's led me to think, for the system as a whole, I guess it's a productivity loss if we're spending the same and kids aren't attending. So it's led me to wonder, what is there a hybrid technology solution, perhaps, that makes it easier for kids to access without having to go through the stress of attending all of school? Well, that's not what you're doing, George. You're in school, but I couldn't resist asking what you thought about that issue.
I totally agree. I think there is a different way of supporting children that are non-school attenders and are defiant in not attending school. If we can offer a hybrid approach initially, especially to try and build that confidence and that sense of belonging before they come back into the mainstream environment, I think we should explore that. And I'll take it back to the pandemic. Luckily, we had devices, so our children got a really positive deal in terms of connection with teacher, feedback on work, and that was really positive. So I think there is a model and there is something to be explored there to have an impact on attendance. Our PA post-pandemic was 28%, so over a a quarter of our children were persistently absent from school. We've reduced that to 8%. And I think that engagement in learning and removing barriers for children through the technology has had a real positive impact on that.
Thank you. I've got a question from Ruth Dixon, who's asked did teachers initially have to invest a lot of time changing lesson content and style? And I'd be interested in in addition to the upfront financial costs, were there other management or preparation costs associated with the transition?
I think what we tried to do was do this with staff. So, for example, we tried to focus on certain elements that we could improve rather than we're going to use technology, it's going to transform everything. So initially we focused on feedback and said to staff, you've got half a term to explore feedback and give feedback in the best way possible that you think through technology. And then we'll come together and write the feedback policy together. It is a huge change, and to make sure we get the culture right and staff on board, I thought that was the most powerful way of moving forward with the technology. In terms of investment in CPD, initially we worked with a company called Sync to look at the basics and the basic management of devices and basic CPD to improve pedagogy. But you soon start finding expert teachers will take this and it will enhance already good practice. So we started building that expertise in-house. So we don't really pay for any external support or CPD.
Thank you. And just one more final very quick question from the audience.
Thanks. I'm Rebecca Hogan. Amongst other things, I'm a primary school governor. I'm just curious how you assess the quality of the resources and the software that you're using on your devices in school.
Yeah, so we use an app called Shobi, and all modelling tasks, all resources go through that app. So I can see remotely from my device or SLT, when we do our monitoring, we can look on Shobi and we give feedback on the quality of resources, the quality of outcomes, just as you would in a traditional exercise book. And we also do collaborative team teaching, staff share resources. We also do sounds quite cheesy saying this out loud, but we do a share a mare. So staff share examples of where practice might not have gone right to build that culture if it's okay to make a mistake, and the best schools fail quicker is almost our motto. So we still have a high accountability and high expectations. I think it's just more easily accessible for SLT in terms of monitoring as well.
Perfect. George, thank you very much. We're going to have to move on to the next speaker. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Steph Hamilton and Cara Ackroyd.
Hi, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me if you are joining us remotely. Thank you so much for inviting us to talk to you today about school engagement and how we look at this as a lead indicator for outcomes. So, as many of you will already be aware, we have a huge teacher recruitment and retention crisis in education. We have more teachers leaving earlier in their career. We have not enough recruits to fill that space, and so we have an increasing burden on teacher vacancies. And this has a massive knock-on effect to leaders' time, effort, and their budgets. So what we really need to think about is what data do they need in their hands to make the best decisions possible and use their time and energy where it is going to have the most impact. So 3 years ago, we set up the engagement platform, which supports schools and trusts to look at engagement data across employees, pupils, and families later this year. And the aim is really to improve that engagement for better outcomes, culture, and wider community relations. And what we're talking about when we're talking about engagement, because you can define it in many creative ways, we're really looking at the level of commitment, involvement, and emotional investment an individual has with their school or in any educational setting that they are within. And what we're particularly excited about is we can use this measure as a lead indicator for later outcomes. So just focusing in on the school employees section today, we know that high employee engagement is a lead indicator of high retention, that positive and sustainable working cultures, and linking into pupil attainment and progress. We're also looking at this pupil engagement, and there was a question about attendance before, and we are really excited about some of the data that's coming back, linking high pupil engagement to later attendance. So how can we use some of this data to get ahead of some of the issues that are going to come up? And so we're starting to see this in some of the data that we are coming through. So Professor John Jerram, who's our Director of Research, has been looking at some of this data and how it changes over time, and do we see this predictive factor coming in? Excitingly, we do. So we can see that scores that school employees, so teachers and wider support staff, that what they give in the November census that we run are directly predictive as to whether they're going to be there in the summer term. We're going to be looking at this, whether this effect continues longer, but we can already see that effect. And we're also looking at the impact that different engagement drivers might have on why people are staying and what makes the biggest difference. So we know that buy-in to strategy and buy-in to their leadership team are overwhelmingly the most important factors as to whether somebody is going to stay at their school, but also stay in the wider profession as well. If they're bought in and they are on board with the leadership team, we know that things like pay, workload are still important, but aren't going to have as significant an impact when that leadership is really strong. So what do we measure? So we look at cognitive engagement, emotional engagement, how these feed into behavioural engagement. So really thinking about what do people think, what do they feel, and how do they actually act. And then we look at how this feeds into those intermediate outcomes and those longer term outcomes that we want to see. We have fixed question sets that we have carefully refined over time, and we're always editing slightly, that are tailored for different roles that get into these three domains. As well as asking these fixed questions, we also ask them in a fixed time frame, which allows us to give live benchmarking to schools. So they're asking, kind of getting that clear snapshot and comparison point to people in the same boat as them at the same time. So they know where they're above benchmark and where they're below benchmark, and can finely tune where they need to put their attention. We channel all of this through our platform at a school and trust level, and allow them to dig into that data, automate the collection so it's not an additional workload burden, and my team are there to support them to understand, analyse, and use and act on this data as quickly as they can. One of the trusts that we worked with really early on is OGAT. And so to talk a little bit more about practically what does this data do for them on the ground, I'm going to hand over to Cara.
Afternoon, everybody. My name's Cara Ackroyd. I've got a very sore throat, so I apologise. In my role, I'm executive principal of all of our secondaries, so 28 secondary schools spanning sort of the north of England, from Middlesbrough, I say south down to Nottingham. It's not quite as far south as here. Over to the west, so we have 2 schools in the northwest, and then over to the east as well. So we worked with the teacher engagement platform, the engagement platform, as part of a wider employee engagement strategy to really look at, how are we ensuring that our vision of our staff being our most valuable resource is really enacted on the ground and put to very good use. So we were the first trust to do this, I think, to look at that live benchmarking. We had some fantastic support from the tech team for leaders in being able to understand what was the data saying that came back to us. And we've seen already some huge impact over the course of the 2 years. So to speak to some of that, particularly around the teacher retention crisis that Steph talked about, in the academic year 22-23, teacher retention for our trust was 84%, and last year it was 94%. So we'd already seen a 10% increase. We've got a number of other engagement measures that we look at, such as non-specialist teaching in secondary, which we know is an issue, particularly in our Middlesbrough academies. Making sure that we're fully staffed with specialist teachers obviously has a huge impact on pupil outcomes. And we've currently got our lowest rate of non-specialist teaching in the last 10 years, which is really bucks the national trend. We have also seen some great retention rate increases for our support staff as well. So what that's meant is that through using this benchmarking, and it was part of a much wider employee engagement strategy that would take much longer than these few minutes to talk about, but it has allowed us to measure that. And what we've seen, you can see at the bottom there, a consistent increase in engagement across the 5 census windows, and some of those headline measures, as I talked about, already coming through. But we've also reimagined some of the CPD that we offer through our Institute of Education. So the emphasis on leadership really came through, as Steph said. It came through much stronger than we at first maybe thought that it would. And that's meant that our professional development offer has been able to really focus on school leadership. And then the idea of staff voice and being able to go back to staff. So our leaders, once they've looked at their data at that census window, they'll go back to teachers and to support staff and say, you said this, so we're now doing this. And that in itself is a part of that wider strategy. I think Steph is going to just quickly talk. I don't know, it says there was a timer, but I can't see it.
I can't see it, but we'll quickly. I think the main thing that sort of we're thinking about going forwards is how do we tie the engagement together of all of these groups in school. So we mainly focused on employee engagement today, but at the moment we're in the middle of a massive national research kind of study on pupil engagement, which has over 100,000 pupils taking part. We're going to be publishing some of the first data on that on Friday, so keep your eyes peeled and please come and speak to us about it. And we're going to be focusing on adding in that family engagement later on in the year, and so leaders are getting that whole picture. But we'll pause there and we'll come to some of your questions.
Perfect, thank you. Take a seat. First question I wanted to ask, again, sorry, I'm obsessed by money. Have you done any assessment of the cost-benefit analysis of this, of the cost of taking it on versus the benefits that you've seen in terms of retention and elsewhere?
I mean, in terms of what it costs schools to do for a subscription, it depends on their school size. So it ranges from £400 for the teeny tiny schools to nearly £2,000 for the largest school. I think if we compare that to maybe what an average secondary school spends on supply cover, but also recruitment costs, that's into the hundreds of thousands. So while this is a cost that schools kind of take on to get into the rhythm of it, it will save tons of time getting to the point of where their challenges are, but also things that they're doing really well at and need to keep doing. But I think you can look at the retention of teachers even within OGAT. That is going to massively reduce the spend. And I don't know, Cara, what do you think?
I mean, there's also things that there are obviously so many control variables here. So I appreciate that, but there are things such as some of the impacts that George talked about in that first presentation. So our sort of post-pandemic recovery around attendance and persistent absence, which is looking really, really positive. And that in itself, I think, speaks to the fact that teaching is an entirely relational, approach, isn't it? And that what happens is that when our teachers stay in our schools, the relationship that they build up with their pupils over time is obviously powerfully immeasurable, isn't it? Yeah. And I think that although we wouldn't be able to make a direct correlation to why is attendance improving, particularly you're talking about some of those schools in Middlesbrough, pupil premium is 70% and above. It's not an easy job. So we need really special people to come and turn up every day. So we also need to make sure, that their voice is heard, but when they're brilliant, that they stay with us.
Thank you. I'm going to open up to questions from the audience, and we'll also take online questions. Okay, let's got online. What's been the most surprising thing you've found a school has seen in the data?
I mean, so every school has variation within their own data, and I think that is probably one of the most fascinating things to me. You've obviously got schools that are beating benchmarks across the board and are doing really interesting things, and then you've got some schools in incredibly challenging circumstances. But each school has those bright spots and the challenges within that building. The most variation you're going to see is within the schools. I think one of the kind of surprising findings that is going to, we're going to be talking about in the publication on Friday is around actually the pupil side, where we've seen a you expect that drop off in engagement to come between sort of year 6 and year 7, but where we see the most significant drop off is between year 7 and 8. And we're going to start cracking into this data to understand at what point does it start dropping off? Is it when they enter year 8? So our census window is going to help us get that sense of where that changes through the year. But that data is reflected within every school. So this is a national challenge that we have at those stages.
There was also some really interesting sort of nuances in that data as well that showed that it wasn't just a factor of age.
Yeah.
So when we looked at pupils that were September born and August born, it wasn't just about teenage hormones or anything else. It literally falls off a cliff in year 7 and begins to only barely recover in year 11.
Yeah.
Of course, at post-16, there is some recovery, but never back to where engagement was when those pupils left primary school. Which I thought would have been my question, certainly, to George, about what those pupils do with the devices when they leave primary school.
Thank you. Question from the audience.
Hello, Stuart Hollynott from the Institute of Government. Just wondering if you could talk a bit more about the actual surveying you do. Do you have the same questions? Do you add new questions for particular topics you find interesting? And also, how do you do the benchmarking compared to other schools? Do you group them in sort of types of schools or... Yeah, what's the process for that?
Yeah, so we have fixed question sets because we don't want to ask any questions that aren't going to tell schools anything. So we've really carefully refined what that list is over time, and we are always doing additional psychometric testing on it, taking anything out that doesn't work. We will be allowing schools to add 1 or 2 custom questions on, but we really want to keep it tight. And if you're asking the same thing at the same time, it means that you are benchmarking for the same thing nationally within that time window. One of the massive benefits of doing that is as the outside pressures change over time, you can remove those factors to a certain extent from when leaders are looking at their data. So this was really useful a couple of years ago where we had all those teacher strikes going on. So when they're doing that census and comparing to everyone else in that window, everybody's having that effect of teacher strikes going on. So leaders can't look at their data and be like, oh, it's a bit low this time because I know we were having some challenges with teacher strikes. You can be like, everyone was in that rough same boat. It's not exactly the same everywhere. But it means you can kind of clear the decks a little bit with kind of the external noise and think, how am I doing compared to my peers? And in terms of the benchmarking, we give them a national one, but we also give contextual ones so they can switch on their phase benchmark and we'll have the disadvantage kind of percentage benchmark coming on really soon as well. So yeah, that answers your question. There's more I could tell you about it, but I'm going to keep it short.
Have you noticed any common characteristics among this kind of the schools or the multi-academy trusts that have taken you on?
It's a real mix. We've got lots of different sizes. We have lots of different kind of sort of values and philosophies about how to run their trusts. We have lots of community schools that are taking part by themselves. We've got special schools, we've got AP schools, so the kind of variety we've got in there is really mixed. I think what is a common thing on the trust level is those trusts are really keen for the feedback and ready for that feedback. Where that, all the schools in their trust might not be at the same stage when they join us. So we've got a big variety on where schools are in their journey that come on board with us. But certainly I think a big common factor is being ready to be open to that data and wanting to lift the lid and see quite clearly where their challenges are and where those benefits are, and want to use that data to move forwards.
And Cara, question for you. It's more broadly a kind of what are the barriers to entry for a school engaging with this platform? Did you feel any kind of opposition, or did you have any kind of what were the things that you needed to be comfortable with to sign up?
Yeah, I think that opening the box for leaders was really important. So we did some big work we have an annual leadership conference, and we did a big piece of work with our leaders to say, this is about the culture of feedback. And it's something where we've got to have that culture to be able to look at that, and that runs through to all the layers of middle leadership. So, for example, the teacher analysis does break it down by departments in the school. It breaks it down to different, if it's groups of ECTs, whatever it might be. And then I think the only other part to add to that would be when it comes, the teacher one is very easy. There's no workload associated. It's an email. You click on the link in the email. It takes 5 or 10 minutes to complete. The pupil one, you've got to get really good completion rate. You know, it's a 3-week window. It takes the 3-week window. It takes, you know, our pupils don't necessarily have their own devices, so it takes a little bit of organising. So just perhaps a little bit of work to do that. Yeah.
And that was a question online, is that are pupils answering the questions themselves, or is it kind of representative sample, or?
Yeah, so for pupils, we do Key Stage 2 and above, so this doesn't include early years and Key Stage 1. And what we ask schools to do is give them the support that they would usually have to do a bit of work. So, you know, some pupils that do have that one-to-one support guiding them through things will get that as they go through the survey. And we have, you know, there's lots of different adaptations that they can switch on if they need some more guidance through it. The best thing is that they can do it by themselves. And for pupils, it's tailored to reading age as well. So they're not, you know, we're assessing the same sentiment across all the year groups, but the primary one is worded quite differently from the ones we ask for sixth form.
Perfect. We've got another question from the audience.
Hi there, I'm Ollie. I'm from the Royal Society just down the road. I'm curious about whether you've noticed any relationship between engagement and workload. George raised the prospect that basically time saved on one task for a teacher does not necessarily mean time saved overall. And like highly engaged teachers might see their work as never done. And so have you noticed any kind of like productivity risks with higher engagement or anything like that?
So I think, workload is never done in education. And so the scores for workload are chronically low nationally. What that doesn't mean is that there aren't schools doing incredible things to beat that. It's because, as by nature of asking those questions, and because we're never done with things, they're always going to be lower. What we find when we look at this data is workload is usually a symptom of other things happening across the other drivers. So you might see workload and behaviour markers being low together. You might see workload alongside line management support and leadership being low together. So often, if their workload scores are below benchmark, we often support them to look at, well, where else have you got some low markers? And that might be the way to start. Because you can tie yourself in knots trying to do workload things and copying and pasting things from other schools and not necessarily you're never going to get 10 out of 10 for workload. It's just not the nature of the system. But what you might be able to do is improve the support that they might have from their line manager to get solutions and soundboard off, or it could be that they don't understand the behaviour strategy, or there's a certain weakness in their area of school where, you know, it's going to mean it's harder to implement some of those strategies, which then has a massive knock-on effect of workload. So workload, it's obviously what we're all talking about, and we need there to be some more headspace for all teachers and leaders and everybody in education. But when those scores are low and below benchmark, there's normally something else going on.
Thank you. I'm afraid that's all we have time for now, so if you could join me in a round of applause. Thank you. We'll now move on to our final speaker, who's Lauren Wilson.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lauren Wilson, and I am the Head of Marketing and Communications for the Thinking Schools Academies Trust. And I work as part of our central function that's also known as Thinking Solutions for Education. And Thinking Solutions for Education homes all of our central services. We've tried to come away from the central service, central office kind of language and moving into central solutions, is that we are exactly what we say on the tin here. We serve 26 schools across the South East, the South West and the South. Whilst serving those 26 schools, they are also a mix of secondary, grammar, alternative provision, primary and nursery. And essentially we call our schools our clients, and we want to make sure when we're serving our clients, we are doing the right thing for them to be able to start to redirect their focuses again back into putting children first and putting the focus back into the day-to-day job. So Thinking Solutions is here to support those schools in doing just that, by doing the right things, by providing a top-level strategic support to our schools, ensuring that our leaders are feeling supported to make the right decisions and improve efficiencies and effectiveness in their operations now, but also trying to future-proof them for the future as well. By doing things in the right way, it means that we are constantly putting children, schools, and their learning at the forefront of any changes and innovations that we want to support the schools with. And doing things at the right cost, it's not always around value for money, it's also value for time. And we know there's no magic solution to giving our schools more time, but being able to create better efficiencies in our schools with expert support from Thinking Solutions for Education allows, again, leaders to focus on putting a children first lens on back into their schools whilst we look after the central focuses behind there. So a little bit about my team is my team, Thinking Creative. They are the marketing and communications element of the trust. And we are a team of 5, so productivity has to be at the top of everything that we do. And we're led by four values. The first one being we are a trusted service to our schools. I've got a team built of experts from previous journalists, commercial backgrounds, and from the education sector. So there's a whole wealth of knowledge in there that contributes to a range of campaigns that we run across our individual academies and across the trust. We are solution focused, which is my personal favourite one, because if we're not solution focused, we can't make positive change. And the marketing and communication solutions that we proactively work to put into schools aim to make things a lot easier and simpler and to get by the regular activities that kind of come up. And my 2 case studies that you'll see shortly will help underpin just some of the work that we've been doing. But also being approachable to our schools. Again, Thinking Solutions for Education, we pride ourselves on being seen within our schools and building really strong partnerships with our individual schools, regions, and as a whole as a trust, because then we really get to know the schools and the communities that they're serving, which really helps us build strong and effective marketing and communications campaigns. And we're timely in that approach. Thinking Creative has been around for about 4 years within our trust, and we've learned a lot along the way. We've got used to the peaks and troughs of kind of a normal school year, and we've kind of really mapped out our processes to really support schools and making sure we can put efficiencies first in the solutions and the service that we provide to our schools. So the first case study I want to draw you to is school admissions. And a few years ago, we identified schools all obviously doing their own advertising for school admissions. Some were doing it really well. Some would be a bit of a last minute kind of, we got to get some advertising out, and some were kind of starting to see a decline in kind of first choice selections with their parental communities. So we stripped the whole thing right back to really what is it essentially that our schools need to take the first step in having a good, strong first step into kind of promoting their schools as their first choice, and then how can we kind of protect that kind of moving forward. So the first part of the solution package was we streamlined our marketing assets for each individual school. So every individual school got a pack of assets that included a templated prospectus, a banner, leaflets, posters, and text to help them communicate and share their open days and admissions and promote them to the right audiences. But these packs were also bespoke to the schools, so they still didn't lose their identity. The schools were still able to tailor their values and missions. They were able to keep their own branding. This was very much a starting step to just help put the first step forward in making sure that campaign can land really well. Schools that we knew that were struggling with hitting their pans for the years ahead, I would deploy a member of our marketing team, and we are only a team of 5, so we made sure that the schools that we knew were going to struggle had early onset intervention to support them with building a wider admissions campaign that had specific goals in improving student recruitment and also promoting their schools into pockets of the community that their schools served. And we also considered rebranding projects, and rebranding isn't a word I like to use too lightly because it does take years and years of work and nurturing to really grow a brand that can foster and flourish within the community. But I wanted to highlight the rebrand that we did at Pembridge schools in 2023. Originally, they were known as Penhale Infants and Newbridge Junior School. Both schools worked really closely together, and about 80% of children would go from Penhill Infant School onto Newbridge quite succinctly. And they were part of the trust, and what we wanted to do was really show our community this through school approach and the values that having a through school education for our children can really improve learning outcomes and make sure our children flourish. So we then birthed the Pembridge Schools rebrand, which saw an increase again in student recruitment. We exceeded the plan and continue to exceed it quite comfortably for the school, but also fostered a "you said we listened" approach within our community. Portsmouth is a very densely populated town, so we need to make sure when we are thinking around rebranding our community messaging that was going to go straight into the community really quickly. So we really played to the strengths of that parental community and what the rebrand could accomplish, and we saw some really brilliant successes. But also, when we do have strong admissions campaigns and increased admissions do come forward, it does open the opportunity for further growth within our secondary schools, like the Victory Academy. See, we increased their admissions through a good, strong admissions campaign, but it's now also supporting plans to expand the new sixth form centre and an SEM unit, which is further embedding itself within the community up in Chatham and further serving a range of diverse needs of the community up there. The second case study is recruitment, and I think I've hit a theme today, which is brilliant. But we know schools and trusts are really challenging to recruit the best teachers. The market is tougher than it's probably ever been. So how do we make sure that we communicate ourselves as an employer of choice, but also make sure that our schools are able to send the right advertising and the right campaigns out? And again, what we started to do is we stripped back our previous efficiencies of the odd advert was here and we had the odd kind of email here, and pulled it all into a process where actually centrally schools and the trust can access a range of digital and print materials, what they can use to advertise roles really quickly. And again, these can be tailored to a school brand or a trust brand. We also provided strategic social media coordination. So with the regions that we have across TSAT, we would make sure if a school was recruiting for a high-level role, then our feeder schools would support in joint advertising to really bolster and add some extra credibility to the post that we were advertising for. We also reviewed the onboarding of our candidates. We all know that sometimes there can be quite a long wait between the job offer and the member of staff starting with the trust. So actually through that onboarding process, how could we make sure that we were still communicating with our candidates whilst in that wait? They weren't deterred by another opportunity. And we did that through regular, just kind of keeping warm communications that were put through an automated mailing system like your MailChimps, your Contact Monkeys, your Sendables. And these were able just to keep people warm enough to keep it interesting. This is what's going on in our trust at the moment. We can't wait for you to be part of the team. But then also by the time they got to induction, they were already part of the team. They already knew what's going on in the trust. They understood the vision and values of what the trust wanted to promote. And it's a much more comfortable experience to kind of go through. And what this started to then create was a bank of resources. And we are really kind of proud to kind of have a bank now where it's no longer starting from a blank page. We're giving a launch from here's an advertising campaign written for you, here's the posters, the microsite copy already written, which puts hours back into a task that it could be quite admin heavy for our schools. And within that, where we've invested quite heavily into our digital assets and campaigns, we actually saw a significant increase in engagement with our digital channels, especially our LinkedIn areas, when we were going for those kind of leadership and senior roles. But then also not forgetting that our Facebook and our Twitters also saw a big spike as well, just because the assets were becoming more and more regularly seen. It was becoming a bit more of we were expecting this rather than a bit of a one-off fight or flight motion to get the right teachers in. And that's where we kind of saw 1 in 26 of our candidates apply through our social and website channels. So overall, this was probably our biggest time saver. It's one, if we were to, when we work with across the trust and within our schools, we really do highlight these banks of resources, whether it's admissions or it's recruitment. These are adding value into our schools every single day, and it will only continue to grow as we kind of go through different motions. And for those trusts and leaders that have marketing teams or are looking to start with your marketing teams, my advice is to start with your basics and get the basics right first, then go on to bespoke campaigns. And that's where you'll really see a communications and marketing service really thrive and add value and time back into your schools.
Lauren, thank you very much. I want to pick on that question of time and whose time is being saved? Who was it who was previously doing these jobs, or kind of who are spending less time doing it now that they've got these templates to work from? And do you know what they're now doing using that time instead to do, or have you been able to kind of reduce staff in some cases elsewhere?
So previously for admissions, it would be our office teams. There'd be a lead in a school that was kind of putting together an admissions campaign, and that's taking focus away from what we want our teachers and leaders to be doing on the everyday. It's making sure that our school operations on the ground are running really effectively, that there's a focus on curriculum delivery of education and really focusing on student outcomes. And if you've got a central service kind of providing these packs ready to go, we are able to execute information quite quickly. And we start planning the admissions campaigns for our 26 schools as early as March, because some of these will run quite succinctly. We have good years every year for some schools, but we know there'll be a handful that will have a struggling year, and birth rates dropping in some areas. It will become more and more challenging, and that's where we will step in and support our schools and take that burden off the schools so they can continue putting children first in their education, and we take the central part away from them.
Thank you. I'm going to see if there are any questions from the in-person audience. I've got a few coming in online. So first question, do you think these marketing and communication benefits are only really achievable for large multi-academy trusts?
I think it's vary. I started within the trust when we were 19 schools. There was a marketing department before that was just one of two people. And I think this is where you really want to map out your priorities as a trust or an individual or a small mat of schools, of what do you want from that marketing communications team that is a burden to leaders. Essentially, is it kind of how can we put time back to our leaders? Is it through an admissions campaign? Is it through building a community PR strategy to increase our growth in a certain area? These kind of elements, I guess, it's achievable with a team of just one, as long as you kind of really nut down that kind of partnership agreement of what you want to achieve first and start with small steps. It's a common mistake sometimes we see that there's a one person marketing team that tries to do everything, but actually if it's just admissions you want your schools to improve on for the year, then just have that as a function.
Thank you. Another question online is, how do you avoid overwhelming schools with all of the resources that you make available?
Through a number of communications. So we deliver briefings once a term with upcoming dates. These assets are readily available on our intranet as well. So some schools are quite self-sufficient in their ways of kind of leading different campaigns. So as long as that information and these assets are accessible, again, we're slimming down a lot of time with that. So I think as they can be, when we kind of talk about overwhelming with schools, I guess it's making sure that the time is put into it. It can't be a reactive thing. Like we know admissions comes around every year, but sometimes the rush of the campaign can come in. So it's just that gentle reminder, and our leaders are reminded quite early on, this is coming and where to access it. And that just helps get the motions going.
On the question of being overwhelmed, I probably speak for many parents when I certainly feel that I'm often overwhelmed by communication from my kids. Schools, and it often feels poorly coordinated and comes through multiple different platforms. Have you, across your trust, done any work to kind of streamline communications going out to parents?
So we use the we're kind of guided by the schools in what communications flows that they would use and best ways of utilising it. What we do try and do is we do monitor the space between each communications. It can't come all on a Monday and you get nothing by Thursday, because parental brains are going to be exhausted by that point. But actually it's utilising as well the assets that are readily available to the school, not just through mobile and email, but is there just social media and website work that we can do in the background just to soft launch some of these campaign messages whilst not bombarding always through email to busy home lives.
Thank you. Another question online. To what extent does the emissions marketing just increase competition between schools rather than improving system-wide productivity?
I think it's a bit of a 50-50 one, maybe. I think all schools are putting their best foot forward out in those kind of key date times. But I guess it's getting the value where we listen to our parents and kind of the challenges that are either they're being faced as a community or regularly out throughout the year. And actually, a lot of school referrals come best through us through referrals. So as long as we put our core assets out first, a bespoke approach is put in if we know the pounds are dropping, and we would probably take a more competitive edge then, but we would do a kind of across the board launch first before we went into those areas. But I think it's listening to those pain points of your community and then tailoring that approach rather than being really aggressive in that marketing, because it will swamp feeds, it'll fill up emails far too quickly so that we can keep up with it.
Can you say a bit more about the kind of the motivation for setting up the central team, and kind of how long did it take to all be kind of up and running and kind of adding value to all the schools in the trust?
So Thinking Solutions was put into our trust in 2018, and it's kind of gradually built from there. It started with kind of a core few services, and then Thinking Creative was added in 2021. And we've really listened, I guess, to the services that our schools need. It would be very easy for us to mirror a commercial comms and marketing service, like some of our main reputable ones that I'm sure we can all think of. I think what sets us apart is that we've listened to our schools. We are addressing, I guess, what the challenges are now and what we could anticipate for the future as trust grows. Like, how can we make sure our service remains scalable and no one misses out? The schools that joined us in 2019 should still be getting the same service that they get in 2025. But every year we survey our school leaders to make sure that is the right thing that we're doing. And again, we're guided by doing the right thing in the right way at the right cost. And if I can hand on my heart say at the end of the day that the service that we're providing is strategically supporting our schools with building good, positive community relationships, it's getting student recruitment right, it's bringing the right people into our trust, then our mission for growth will be successful.
And were there any kind of key barriers that you kind of had to overcome for the system to work effectively? Was there any opposition from kind of within schools, from people already doing those roles?
Yeah, I think especially from comms and marketing, obviously my team grew from 2 to it's now 5. And there are people in the school that do have a creative bone and they want to kind of make sure it's still kind of understood. And we listen to it. Like, if there's expertise within the schools, I've built my team through taking on experts in the schools, putting into the team, because we're just building that bank of knowledge along the way. And it's getting the schools to understand the value that we're adding back in. So if it's time back into their day to focus on their curriculum planning and their teaching, rather than thinking of how they're going to kind of coordinate social media posting or get their website compliance done. It's the first thing to drop when a school gets busy, is that kind of communications bit, but actually it's the most important bit that needs to be nurtured. So it's a partnership, what I like to call it. I work in partnership with the schools to really understand and tailor, and I will continue to tailor my service to make sure it is right for our schools in Multi Academy Trust.
Lauren, thank you very much. Everyone can join me in a round of applause. I'm now going to welcome our final speaker up onto the stage, Anna Vignoles.
You're not moving this time.
I'm not going to move this time. So look, we've heard kind of 3 quite different presentations, but obviously with some kind of common factors between them. I wonder what your kind of key takeaways were from that.
Well, the fantastic set of talks, all very different, which I thought was really interesting, but they do, I think, have common themes. I mean, the first one is one you've touched on in the last set of questions, which is actually, it's quite hard to define productivity in the public sector. I was struck by George's, always something to be done. True, and many of us doing a range of jobs might feel that at an individual level. But of course, most of our jobs can be measured in a sort of fairly concrete way where we only do things that add to productivity. And I think that's not true in schools, and that's one of the challenges. And I think the other thing that occurred to me is it's not even clear what productive activity looks like. You asked the question about sort of competition between schools. Vital from a school's perspective to make sure that you have the students that you need in order to stay open, obviously. But in terms of actually contributing to productivity across the system, obviously not so much. But the big theme for me was, as you would imagine, teachers and teaching. I was struck by your comment, Cara, about teaching being entirely relational. I mean, schools are entirely relational. And from an economist's perspective, the vast majority of costs are people costs in schools. So whatever we're going to do on productivity, I think it's really obvious that you have to focus on that. And whether it's sort of Steph's engagement work, focusing on teacher buy-in and leadership quality, or whether it was George's point about where would you start in tech? You start in trying to save teachers time, because whilst it's obvious that high teacher turnover is a bad thing, as people have talked about, maybe what's less obvious is that teacher turnover in the profession as a whole is a really bad thing, because teachers take a while to become optimally effective. And if we keep having a large proportion of our teachers always going through that learning experience the first 3 years of their teaching, the system as a whole is always going to be less productive than it should be if we had sort of, say, similar turnover rates to other industries. And then finally, for me, the big theme, which, you can't talk about productivity in any industry without talking about technology. And the thing about technology is the technology of schools, as opposed to within schools, but the technology of schools hasn't changed much. So your 1925 counterpart, don't know what your job they'd be doing, comes down and looks at a school. The school looks slightly different. The classroom looks very familiar. They won't understand why you're doing marketing, but they will absolutely get the point about teachers and being relational. And I think for that reason, EdTech has been a promise that's never delivered as yet. And I think it's really good to hear some of the lessons of EdTech not delivering being sort of reflected in what the Secretary of State recently said about investing in technology for schools. Because if we don't learn why it didn't work last time, it's not going to work this time. And I think we need to be extremely careful about generalizing from, examples where you have fabulous leadership, as we've seen today, doing exciting things. How do you scale that up across the system and make sure it's actually working and actually producing better outcomes? And can we all agree what those outcomes might be? Because it's not just test scores, right? So some real challenges there.
On that question of investment and kind of what Bridget Phillipson should be invested in, I was struck by kind of all of our examples today required some upfront investment, whether that was in kind of equipment, whether it was signing up to the kind of the analysis, whether it was creating a central team. And clearly there's a lot of competition for investment in schools at the moment, whether it's literally leaking schools, looking after them better, whether it's investing in teachers' salaries, whatever, and as well as these additional technological improvements. Where do you think the biggest bang for the buck is? And actually, is that a decision that is best made in Whitehall, or is that a decision that's best made at trust level or at school level?
Yes, I'm not sure the answer's there at Whitehall, but no, it's a more serious question. That investment is essential, and when I said we need to learn from the past, you need the investment in the physical bits of kit. But as we've heard, particularly in with good collaboration with private sector providers, the actual upfront cost of tech may be less than we feared, and you might find it round the edges. What I worry about is EdTech has failed in the past because it's failed to deliver what schools really would benefit from, and has not come alongside investment in teaching time to learn how to use the tech or how to apply it. And in exceptional schools, you might get staff to focus on one aspect. For example, the feedback, great place to start. It's very motivating. Nobody wants to spend all weekend marking. You can get a concerted effort going on it, and maybe teachers will find ways of doing that within the time they have. But if you're talking about technological revolution writ large, you absolutely have to invest in the teacher time to figure out what that looks like, not least of which planning a system. And that will require money. So I don't have any easy answers, but a recognition right the way through the system that you don't switch to a technologically driven school that easily without some upfront costs.
I think it's probably fair to say that Bridget Phillipson has been one of the most active secretaries of state of this new government and is putting in place a number of reforms. Some of those would kind of limit some of the autonomy that academies currently have, for example, on pay, ability to employ non-qualified teachers, or around the curriculum. It struck me today all kind of three of our presentations were from academies. Do you think that any of the changes being brought in by Bridget Phillipson will kind of help or hinder or make more likely or less likely the kind of innovations within the school sector?
So, I mean, first of all, I think we did hear that, for example, the work on engagement was also involving community schools. So I think we need to be careful, and not least it might be reflecting who you can get to come to London on a weekday. But that aside, I think one of the things to reflect on when you're thinking about whether one particular institutional type is better than another, the evidence does not suggest there's a wild difference in performance across different school types. And I've argued for about 20 years now that the focus on institutional arrangements, school types, how, very specific governance issues, is rather unfortunate, given that we know that it's not making a great deal of difference to performance. And by performance, I'm obviously thinking about performance that so far has largely been measured in qualifications, test scores, other kinds of outcomes. And I think, what does make a difference to outcomes? Teachers, teaching quality. So all of the things that these great schools are focusing about, teacher turnover, etc., all the evidence suggests that's what we should be worrying about. So I guess that's a long way of saying some of the changes, if it enables more in the system, more resource in the system, and enables people to focus on teachers and teaching, the fact that you're sort of slightly changing the governance arrangements probably is neither here nor there, frankly.
Thank you. Let's see if there are any questions from the audience. We'll take these two questions here. If I could ask them to be quick, because we're quite short on time.
Faye Ainscoe, retired journalist with a special interest in using chess for educational purposes. My understanding is that most teachers who leave the teaching profession is because of the administrative workload, and they just are teaching less and having more admin. Now, is this from some central government edict that this has risen, or is this something that just evolves more in some schools than others?
Thank you. And just very quickly,
Laura van Versteden, I'm from the Dutch Embassy. And I was wondering what role you see for teacher training in this, and also in the sort of the digital shift that we're looking towards to increase productivity at schools.
Perfect, thank you. So two questions there, one on training and one on kind of bureaucracy.
Yeah, well, we call it bureaucracy, we can call it workload, we can call it lots of things. It's a very good question. When I said that your 1925 counterpart would recognise the classroom, it wasn't a completely flippant comment that they wouldn't recognise all the bits that go around the classroom. So we have very high expectations of data collection, of how schools will run, of safeguarding, and a lot of this is vital, but it just takes extra resource. So I think it's the wrong way to think about it of, it's bureaucracy, how do we get rid of it? It's what do we as a community think is the minimum acceptable level of risk? What should our teachers be doing in terms of data collection? Because you can't have it both ways. You can't have really sort of micro information about what's happening in the sector every moment of the day and then say, but teachers shouldn't be filling in data, because the two kind of go together. And likewise, on safeguarding, what works, what's effective, vital, but some sensible decisions about risk-taking there also need to happen. In terms of your question about initial teacher education, a very interesting one, but I'd refer back to my point about giving teachers time. The vast majority of teachers currently are obviously already in schools. We are much better at putting things into initial teacher education than we are about finding the resources to give teachers time out of the classroom in order to update their CPD. Most CPD is generic, but as we heard, teacher specialisms is a vital area where we can really make a difference with some of this stuff. Much of the CPD might need to be quite subject specific. What does tech look like in a physics classroom when you're trying to draw graphs on an iPad versus what does tech look like in literature where you're able to have all of the books in the world at your disposal? These are really important questions. So yes, teacher, of course, you're right, initial teacher education needs to take technology on board, for example. But I think a bigger issue is what are we doing to give teachers time to learn throughout their career? And is that part of the engagement story that we were talking about in terms of keeping them in profession?
Thank you. With that, I'm going to have to bring this event to an end. I said at the start, this is our 5th in the series. Our 6th in the series is due to take place in March and will be focused on central government innovations. Until then, thank you to all of our brilliant speakers, and thank you to the Productivity Institute for supporting us with this work, and thank you to everyone who's watched in person or watched back later. Thank you.